Okay, so the date is the 22nd of October. We're at the Museum of Science and Industry in Manchester. And we've got Norman here, who's going to answer some questions for us. So first off, just a few general background questions. Could you tell me your full name, where you were born, and when you were born, please?
Yes, my name is Norman Hindley. I was born in Holland Street in Astley Bridge in Bolton on the 14th of September 1930.
Okay then, and could you tell me a bit about your parents? Were they local, and what jobs did they do?
Yes, my parents, my father was from Bolton, my mother was from Hoylake. My mother worked in the mills as a box tenter. I can't remember its proper name, but she was a box tenter, but she could virtually work any machine in the cotton mill. My dad was a grinder, but unfortunately the firm he worked for, Dobson and Barlow's, they moved from Waterloo Street in Bolton to Bradley Fold in Bolton in 1930-31, and about 1,000 men lost their jobs, and unfortunately my father and my grandfather were two of the people who lost the jobs. He was a grinder by trade, and he was out of work for 7 years during the Depression. He finally got a job in 1938. The dole money he brought home was 23 and sixpence, or £1.16 a week to look after us. And I started school in 1934 at St Paul's Infant School, moved on to the primary school. I left there at 11, went to Castle Hill Secondary School, and left school at 14.
Okay. You said that there was 1,000 men were made redundant, or around?
Yeah.
Was that sort of localised, or?
Yeah, there were local men actually. The thing was, Dobson and Barlow's was one of the biggest employers in the town, and they made a lot of mill machinery equipment, not only for here in the UK, but they exported a lot around the world. And in fact, they're now defunct, they've gone altogether, but even when they were at Bradley Fold, they employed roughly 4,500 people in the factory.
Okay then, brilliant. Well, you've touched on your childhood a little bit, but what would you say your earliest memories were?
Earliest memories? Well, I can remember the first day I went to school. That was when I was about 4.5, and I can recall going into the classroom for the first time. And the amazing thing was the desks. There was about 4 desks, and they had bowls of water on the desks, and we were taught how to wash our hands before going for a meal, which was something. And it's amazing how this sticks in your mind. I can remember learning my tables from 1 to 12. We were 6 when we learned these, or were taught them. And I can remember the day that war broke out as well. I know I sound like a comedian, but I can remember September the 3rd, 1939. I can remember Neville Chamberlain on the radio saying that if Germany doesn't pull out of Poland by 11 o'clock this morning, we'll be at war with Germany. And it's very vivid in my mind. I don't know why, but it is. I suppose it was because they broadcast this virtually every 15 minutes that we were at war with Germany. And so those are some of my memories up to being 9 years old. Do you want me to go back? One thing I do remember was leaving St Paul's at 11 and going to Castle Hill, and I was there for 3 years. It was amazing, wartime days they were, when things were very hard to come by. Most things were rationed, and so I can recall my mother sharing recipes that saved on heating and saved on food in one sense. For instance, She would use liquid paraffin in a cake rather than use lard, and things like this. And there are a number of leaflets which I've left with the museum with regard to some of the hints and tips that the government came out with during the war. I can recall during the wartime days, queuing virtually for everything. The old saying was quite right: if you saw a queue, join it, because you didn't know what was at the end of the queue. And it is so when you go into supermarkets now, it's hard to believe that you went into a greengrocer's shop, for instance, and all that you saw were baking apples. Very few, you never saw a Golden Delicious, a few Coxes, but that's virtually it. They were quite hard days, especially for the housewife. But as children, we didn't realise how hard it was, because everybody was in the same boat, so that was it.
Do you think from that there was a greater sense of community or a war effort?
Well, there was actually. We were very fortunate in Bolton because we didn't get the bombs that Manchester got. You could see Manchester on fire from the hills around Bolton, and but even so, you found this community spirit, which actually in the 30s there was a community spirit. I know it sounds funny, but there was always a lady in the street who could lay somebody out who died. I know that sounds strange, but it used to happen. If anybody was ill, all the neighbours used to gather around and help out. I can remember as well in the 30s that when people had had the tea, in fact my daddy used to get a cushion and put it on the front doorstep and start to clean his pipe out and refill his pipe with tobacco, and sit there with a look of contentment on his face. And also I remember my mother used to bring a chair out, and all the neighbours used to bring chairs out. I say all the neighbours, a lot of the neighbours, and you got a lot of chatting across the street, neighbour to neighbour. And there was a lot of neighbourly things happened where my mother would go probably a couple of doors up, knock on the door, walk in, and sit there and have a cup of tea, and it was a very, very friendly sort of atmosphere. But the thing was that, looking back, I realised how poor people were in those days. One cold water tap in a house, outside toilets, and actually a lot of houses hadn't got flush toilets. They were what we called tippler toilets or long drops. And things were very austere. In fact, today, all those dwellings would have been condemned out of for health and safety reasons and other reasons, So things today are far better than they were way back in the 30s and 40s. But it was amazing, really, how we got through during the war. And as I say, we were very lucky. We had about 64 bombs dropped in Bolton. Unfortunately, most of them were dropped on the moors. Probably the German bombers hadn't finished bombing, but they wanted to get rid of the bombs, so they dropped a stick on Smithers Moor, and so that was it. Yeah.
Can you just tell me a little bit about what the houses themselves were like? Were they terrace?
Yeah. Well, actually, I do a talk on our house in the 30s. We had just a 2 up, 2 down with an outside loo house, one cold water tap, no hot water whatsoever, and most of the cooking in the 30s was done on the open fire. We had cast iron fireplaces, and actually they were all things to all men in one sense. The cast iron fireplace had an oven. It also had a water boiler. At one side of the grate was the oven, on the other side of the grate was a water boiler with a little tap at the bottom, but people didn't use those very often because the water came out a rusty colour. But they were ideal places just to keep the kettle on or the teapot on, so if anybody did call, they were guaranteed to get a good cup of stewed tea with it there. There was all kinds of furniture with the fireplace, trivets that used to they were on a pivot and they go over the fire where you could put your pans and your pots. The grate itself had a shelf at the front over the fire. Well, I'm saying over the fire. just outside the fire, but things could be kept hot on there. And in those days, we had middens, or ash pits as we called, but a lot of the stuff, the waste stuff that we put in our bins today, used to put on the fire. Potato peelings, cabbage, uneaten food, they would go straight on the fire and up the chimney. And I can remember in those days, we used to light the fire. To set the fire, we'd clear all the old ashes out, layer the grate with paper, firewood and coal on top, light the paper, and then we used to get a shovel and put it the wrong way round in front of the fire. And in those days, most newspapers were broadsheets. We used to get a broadsheet of paper and put it across the fire to create a draft. And then you had a crisis because the newspaper used to explode into flames when it got too hot. But it gave you a nice draft to get the coal burning. The mantelpiece was quite a thing on those fireplaces. You always knew the financial situation of people in those days because all the unpaid bills used to be stacked at the back of the clock in the centre of the mantelpiece. And on the mantelpiece you used to keep your cruet with your salt and pepper in, your tea caddy, your sugar basin, so they wouldn't get damp. And also, if you had a smoker in the house, the man's pipe rack used to be on there. And no wall-to-wall carpets. Used to have a carpet square. We had a carpet square in what we call the sitting room today. But in the kitchen, we had a coconut matting, which was rather cheaper than a carpet. And I can remember up to about 1934, in the kitchen, my mother used to mop and scrub the flags of the floor every week until we actually had enough money to buy some oilcloth, as we called it in those days. It's called linoleum today. The bedrooms were sparsely furnished, but I do remember that the old oilcloth that used to wear out because our floors were flagged, consequently the flags were uneven, so you got uneven wear both on your carpet and on your oilcloth. And about every 3 months you'd turn the carpet round so you get a bit of uneven wear somewhere else rather than in the same spot. The same with the lino, that used to wear away, but you didn't throw it out, you actually kept it because it would come in for upstairs in the bedroom. Because in those days, you didn't take people upstairs in the bedrooms. If anybody goes into a new house today, you give them a grand tour, you take them right round. But in those days, they didn't get upstairs. Consequently, you could use 2 or 3 different patterns of oilcloth, as we called it, in the bedrooms. And nobody was any the wiser except the immediate family. And I can remember the old flop mattress and the brass bedsteads, the small fireplace in the bedroom. And I can remember if you were ill and you were confined to your bed in the bedroom, I can remember my dad used to get a shovelful of fire from the fire downstairs, carry it upstairs. I don't know what health and safety would say about this. He used to carry a shovelful of burning coals up the stairs and put it in the little bedroom fireplace. Also, another thing I can remember about there, fly catchers, sticky fly catchers that used to hang from your gas mantle. We had gas until about 1936, and by the end of the week they just looked as though they were full of currants. I know that sounds a bit off-putting, but they are. And I can remember in those days you could have 24 flies flying around the light in the middle of the room, and nobody bothered. But today, if you get 1 fly going round in the house, people are panicking, getting the spray tins out. And I was coming down to the yard. The toilet was in the yard, and every year you used to get a burst in the toilet, and the plumber would come, and you get bulges in your lead pipe where they'd repaired a burst, and eventually it's so many bulges up they couldn't repair it anymore and had to put a new pipe in. One of the things we tried to stop the pipes freezing was with a little Keller lamp, a little oil lamp, used to put in the toilet in those days.
Okay, and so just finishing off with your home life. What do you do for entertainment? Did you stay in the house, or did you go out on the street play with?
Right. Well, we were very fortunate in those days. I know the children today have a lot more than we had, but they didn't seem to have They don't seem to have the freedom that we had. We had so many areas that we could go and play in woods and areas of spare land and countryside. Most of these places where I used to play are now built over with estates, but in our day we could go out at 9 o'clock in the morning, nip back for our dinner, and we'd be out till 5 or 6 o'clock at night. And our parents, I won't say they weren't concerned where we were, but not the concern as there is today. If a child's out of your sight for half an hour today, it's a bit of a panic. Whereas in those days we were free to do all kinds of things. We used to climb trees and play in streams and generally enjoy ourselves. And then of course we had seasons of games. You had your cricket season where in the back street you got an orange box for wickets and a bat and a ball. And I remember we used to play in the back street, and if you knocked the ball over somebody's yard, you got 6 runs scored, but you were out. 6 and out we used to call it. Also, of course, when the football season started, we used to do that. We used to play hockey in the back streets, get some brush steels and use those as hockey sticks. And then there's also a series when marbles came into things. We used to play marbles, and then we used to play piggy, and they all had the seasons, these games. Also whip and top was another one. And Tig Out Tig was they used to play in the schoolyard. Of course, in the evening when it was dark, you could play a record, but the thing was in the 30s, you had to change the needle every time you played a record. You played a record, and then you had to put a new needle in, which was a bit of a pain. And then in the late 40s, we got a radiogram which played 7 records on the trot, and that was a boon. And we listened to the radio. I used to like listening to Radio Luxembourg, because there's some good programs on there, and one I remember was the Ovaltine's program. And to be an Ovaltine, you had to send 3 Ovaltine labels up to Ovaltine, and you got a badge and a little book with secret codes and signs. And at 5:30 every Sunday night, I used to listen to the Ovaltine show on Radio Luxembourg, and they used to open up with giving you a number of letters for your code book, and you had to find out what these letters meant. Usually it meant, when you worked it out, it used to say, Ovaltine is good for you, and things like that. But we had, as children, I think we had more freedom than the children have today. There was no televisions, of course, just the radio.
Okay, so you've already touched a little bit on your school life. What was the school called, and was it an all-boys school? Was it a friendly, strict place?
I started off at St Paul's School, which was a church school attached to St Paul's Church. Very village-like school, because Astley was a village in those days. It got taken over by Bolton way back in 1898, but even in the 40s and 50s it was still a village type of a place. And in fact, I can remember my mother would never say she was going to town. She was always going to Bolton, as though it was another place far away. I went to St Paul's School. I was there in mixed classes until I was 11, and then we had special buses took us from Astley over to Tom Moore to Castle Hill Senior Boys School. There it wasn't a mixed school. We had Castle Hill Senior Boys and Castle Hill Senior Girls School, and I was there till I was 14. I realised when I got to Castle Hill how life is different, sort of when you leave the comfort of infants and primary school, you start to get a more adult school at the secondary school as it is today. As I say, I stayed there until I finished at Christmas in 1944. In those days, you left school not once a year, you left 3 or 4 times a year, Easter, September and Christmas. I'm not sure whether we left school at June when the holidays were, but I know there was 3 times, and I left at Christmas and started work about 4 weeks later.
Okay. So going back to sort of, well, across school, what were your favourite subjects, and did you have any idea what you wanted to be when you grew up?
Well, yeah, favourite subjects were, I did enjoy maths, strange as it may seem. I know a lot of people don't enjoy maths, but I did enjoy maths. I used to enjoy drama at school as well. I'm no actor whatsoever, but I used to enjoy it. I enjoyed games, of course. And actually, during the war effort was to dig for victory. And in those days, in the UK only grew or produced a third of the food that we ate in those days. In 1939 that was, but by 1945 we grew or produced 2/3, which was quite an achievement in 5 or 6 years. And consequently, people turned the flower beds into allotments to grow vegetables and what have you. And at St Paul's and a local school, which was Seymour Road Methodist, we were allocated a plot of land on Astley Football Club ground. Not on the pitch, I might say, but on the sidelines. And we used to go up there once or twice a week and used to enjoy gardening up there. And I used to enjoy going shopping with my mother. And I think this is one of the reasons I started work at the Co-op, because I used to enjoy going on Friday night. I remember Friday night specifically, when my dad finally got a full-time job. He used to bring his wage home on Friday. I know Thursday is now the payday, but it used to be Friday in those days. And he put it on the table just before we had the tea. My mother would open it up, and she would divide the money up. My dad would get his spending money. I can't remember whether I got any spending money or not, but I did get spending money, but not at that time. My dad would get his spending money, and then the rent money was put at one side. The doctor's money, no National Health Service then, doctor's money was put at one side. Newspaper money, the milk money, and these were put on the sideboard every Friday night, and that was the big divide Friday night, the wage coming in. My mother got a housekeeping, and I can recall Friday nights, you're having your tea, there'd be a knock at the door, and you'd shout, "Doctor," and the man would walk in, you'd be in the kitchen, and you probably wouldn't see him, and he'd just take his money, sign the book, and on his way. Same with the insurance man, the insurance money was there, and you didn't necessarily see these people, but you could safely leave your money there, and it wouldn't walk as it might do today. And of course, Friday night was Co-op night. I used to go. I know I'm saying it the Bolton way. We should say Co-op, but we say Co-op in Bolton. But there we go. Friday night used to go to the Co-op, or as we used to call it, the stores, the local Astley shop, and they were mainly staffed by men in those days. There was only one girl or lady in the shops in those days, and she was responsible for the confectionery, and she used to be called the fecky girl. And but mainly, as I said before the war, the shops were staffed by men, and the men used to ruffle your hair, and they'd cut in a bit of cheese, they'd give you a little piece. And I think this sort of, it seemed a very happy place, and a place that I felt I wanted to work. And eventually it did happen. I started work at the Co-op. I had visions of being an electrician as well, and of course the old train driver, ambitions to be a train driver, but obviously none of those I did.
Okay, so you've began to touch on it. So when exactly was it that you left school?
Well, yeah, I left school at 14, and to get a job at the Co-op in those days, you had to take an exam. You had to pass your exam, or you didn't get a job. And so I was waiting for the exam, and so I've been off school a month, and so for another month whilst I was waiting the results of the exam, I got a job in a grocer's shop, Green's the Grocers, Italian warehouseman, quite a high-class shop in Bolton in those days, although it was wartime, so there wasn't a lot of difference between a high-class shop and the ordinary shop on the corner. And I worked there for a month, and I started on £1 a week, and then I got word that I'd passed the exam and I could start work at the Co-op in Vernon Street grocery shop. And so I gave my notice in at Greens and started as a flower lad at Vernon Street.
Okay, brilliant. I'll just stop it there. Okay, so we're now going to move on to questions about your work life.
Yes.
And so what did you know about the Co-op before you started working there? And what was the general sort of opinion of the place?
Well, the thing was that the Co-op was one of the main retailers, not only in Bolton but in the country. One of the reasons was because of the dividend, and dividend can be as much sometimes as 3 shillings in the pound, which was quite a lot of money that you got back for shopping at the Co-op. And
can I just? Would you mind just explaining exactly what the dividend was?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I thought we might be coming to that later on. The dividend, actually, the Co-op in the 30s and the 40s, they used to divide the year up into quarters, and each quarter, all the money that you spent. I'm sorry, I'll start that again.
Okay.
When you spent your money at the Co-op, whatever you spent it on, whether it be coal or grocery or milk, you got a little paper cheque, and this cheque told you how much you had spent. And you used to stick these cheques on what we called a gum sheet. The official name is a cheque sheet. And then when you'd fill the sheet up with cheques, they were totalled up, and the total was put on the back, and if the totals were right, i.e. the customer totalled them up and you totalled them up, if you agree with the customer's addition, you would give them a new cheque for the total value of all the cheques on that gum sheet. And this used to carry on until what we called cheque taking time. And cheque taking time was once a quarter. It was they used to take cheques in just before Easter, just before the Bolton holiday fortnight at the end of June, before September holiday and Christmas holiday. And what happened was the number of pounds that you'd spent with the Co-op used to work out how much dividend each quarter they could give to each customer per pound. So sometimes the dividend could be 2 shillings in the pound if the Co-op hadn't had a decent quarter there, or it has been as high as 3 shillings in the pound when the Co-op had made a lot more profit. And what happened was, do you want me to go on about the cheque taking and at this point? Yeah, okay. Well, what happened then, you used to, when it became cheque taking time, you took your last gum sheet or cheque sheet, it didn't matter whether it had one cheque on or was full, you would take that to the local grocery store or the main office together with your share book, which was a sort of bank book that the Co-op issued. You took the two, and what happened then, we transferred all the full pounds from your last cheque sheet onto your share book, and we also then gave you a cheque for the balance. So if you had £24, 12 and 4 halfpenny, we'd transfer £24 into the share book, and then we would give you a new cheque for the next quarter of 12 and 4 halfpenny, which you stuck on your new gum sheet, and that was towards your dividend in the next quarter. Your share book, the Co-op they were keeping for 6 weeks to work out your dividend, your total dividend, and also interest in that time. So we used to give you a counterfoil or a receipt for your share book, and on this receipt, this counterfoil, it had your share book number, it had the total amount that you had in your share book when we took the share book off you, It had the total number of pounds we'd transferred from the cheque sheet to the share book on there, and then we used to initial this counterfoil, and you'd have this counterfoil for 6 weeks, and 6 weeks later your dividend was ready for you, so you could take this counterfoil down to the general office, get your share book back, and if you wanted to draw your money, you could draw your money, or you could leave it there. And I know my mother used to leave hers there until just before Bolton holidays, because it helped to pay for a holiday. And the actual committee men at the Co-op in those days were very wise men, because they used to pay a dividend 2 weeks before Easter, 2 weeks before the Bolton holiday fortnight, 2 weeks before September holidays, and 2 weeks before Christmas. It was just the time when people wanted the money.
Okay, sort of sticking on that, did you ever encounter any sort of attempts to defraud you, or you
Yes.
any scams that you like?
Yes, there was. There was a way of writing a cheque out to try and stop people sort of falsifying the cheque. And it's very difficult to explain sort of over a microphone, but if you can imagine a cheque, a piece of paper, and with the figures on 13 shillings and fourpence halfpenny, or £1.13 shillings and fourpence halfpenny, there were times when if your pencil wasn't very sharp, people couldn't read the 13, or shall we say 1, and they'd write over it 13, obviously to defraud the Co-op, to get a little bit extra dividend. And the point was that they didn't realise that the cheque office in the main office, they used to take a random sample of all the cheque sheets, and they'd hold them up to the light. And actually, when we wrote a cheque, we used double-sided carbon paper, which meant that on the reverse of the cheque, in carbon, was exactly what you'd spent. And of course, if you held it up to the light, you could see the carbon copy coming through. And so people were taken to task for that. And they could do one of two things. They had an option, the Bolton Court gave them an option. They could either be prosecuted and get the name in the local paper, and then the neighbours would say, oh, look at Mrs. So-and-so, she's been diddling the Co-op, or they could write an apology. And I believe there was a set apology. I know I don't believe it. There was a set apology, because you've got to remember that even in the late 1800s, the early 1900s, there were a lot of people who couldn't write. So these were ready written, and I can't remember it word for word, but it used to say something like this: I, the undersigned, have been found guilty of defrauding the Co-op by writing certain words on my cheques to get extra dividend. And I would like to make an apology now for to be printed in the Wheat Sheaf magazine, which is a magazine which I've left with you. And so if the people didn't see your name in the local paper, when they got the magazine, which was a free magazine given once a month, they would see your name in there. So you had the option of which you wanted it in. So I'm not sure which option you would pick if you were that way inclined, leave that there.
Okay, so it sounds like the Co-op was sort of very much part of the local community. So what were your sort of earlier memories of it, and did you always shop there? Or?
Well, no, actually. Again, in the 30s, money was very tight, as I've already said early on. We would find, just on a family personal basis, that if you went to the Maypole, you could get £2 of marmalade cheaper than you could buy £2 of marmalade at the Co-op, including the discount of the dividend. And I can recall one time I went down to the Maypole to buy a £2 jar of marmalade, and I put it in my saddlebag in my bike, and I was bumping on and off the pavements, and this £2 jar of marmalade jumped out of the saddlebag and smashed all over the doorstep of a local grocer's shop. And I can't remember what my mother said to me when I got home, but I don't think the grocer would be very pleased finding somebody else's marmalade on his doorstep. So really and truly, there was a certain amount of shopping around in the 30s. But the Co-op was a very happy place. I think this is one of the many reasons I wanted to work there. Everybody seemed so happy. They're all hardworking, and I know from my own time there, you were taught the trade right from A to Z. Nothing was overlooked. It was a very happy place to work at. And the only reason that I left, or the main reason I left, was financial, because the wages at the Co-op before the war, they were very, very reasonable. But after the war, private industry overtook them on the wage front, and consequently I left the Co-op and then went to work at de Havilland aircraft factory in Bolton.
Okay, can you just tell me a bit about where the shop was located, what the area was like? Right,
well, our area, as I say, although it was part of Bolton, we still regard ourselves as villagers. And the shop, it was a sort of a community centre, if you will, the shop. It was where all the gossip was exchanged, because you used to have to queue up for probably 3/4 of an hour on Friday night, everybody doing the weekly shopping. And so you used to see the same people in the shop queuing up, and it was like a community centre. I suppose the nearest to it today is the local post office, where the local gossip is shared. The Co-op in Bolton actually did about 134 grocery shops in Bolton. So virtually they were within 400 yards of each other. In fact, where we lived, it was called Astley Bridge Shop. It is now a Bookies at the bottom of Belmont Road. That was only 200 yards from our house. But if we wanted to go to another one, we'd only have to go about 400 yards to what we call Lambrow, or 500 yards to Ashworth Lane. And so the Co-op shops were, there were many in Bolton. You hadn't to walk far before you found a Co-op shop. Another thing that they had the butchers' departments as well. Not as many butchers as grocery shops, but a lot of the grocery, I think they had 40 or 50 butcher shops attached to the grocery shops, but they were independent shops. You couldn't go into the grocery shop and buy your meat. You had to go next door into the butcher's. Also, they had about 40 boot and shoe shops up and down the town, where you could obviously get your shoes repaired. But I remember as a lad, we used to wear clogs, and we used to have irons on the bottom of the clogs. And I can remember we used to go to the Co-op regularly to have our clogs ironed, i.e. soled and heeled. And I remember going into this dingy little shop with creaking floorboards, and all the knots in the wood were poking through. I think probably because people had walked in there so often with clogs on, and they'd worn the wood away and not worn the knots away. And I think it was fourpence to have your clogs repaired. And you used to pay your fourpence, and you get a little cheque for fourpence, and also a metal disc. And you went to the bottom of the shop and climbed some rickety stairs. And when you got upstairs, there was a dingy room, very poorly lit, and there was 3 cobblers sitting at very low tables with their with all their equipment. And I can remember this table was about 9 foot square, and it was absolutely cluttered, but all the cobblers seemed to know exactly where things were, although it looked absolute chaos. And it was a bit like the barbers. You used to go, and there was a line of chairs at the back, and you sat on the chairs, and you waited for your turn to have your clogs soled and heeled. And you used to move up. As one person went and had theirs, you moved up into his seat and so on. And then the cobbler used to say, "Ask getting the disc, lad." And that he wanted the metal disc before he'd attempt to sole and heel your clogs. And then he'd rip the old irons off, and he'd fit new ones, and tapped them here. Actually, before he fitted them, there was all holes where the nails had been before, and he used to put like little matchsticks in the holes to fill the holes up, and then he'd put the new irons on, and then he'd put a bit of like shoe polish around just to finish them off. And then you had to test your clogs when you got outside to make sure that they made sparks. You used to shuffle your foot on the pavement, and if sparks came out, you were quite happy. So that was going for our shoes to be, well, our clogs to be healed.
Okay. You mentioned that there was sort of a lot of grocers around.
Yes.
Where you worked. Was there sort of any rivalry, or was it friendly?
Well, it's funny talking about that. Yeah, we had. There was the individual grocery shops. You had the corner shops, and virtually every street had its own corner shop in those days. You had your corner shops. You had local multiples. In Bolton, we had a company called Tate's. I don't know how many shops they had, probably 16. And they were like glorified corner shops, really. You also had Blowers, which was another Bolton grocer. That was a little chain of shops in the town. And then you had other chains, Duxbury's, I think they were a Yorkshire firm, Redmond's, they were from Blackburn. And then you had the private grocer, the more, dare I say, upmarket grocer, as well as the posh shops, i.e. John Haslam, and where I worked at Greens, they called themselves Italian warehousemen. So you had quite an array of grocery shops. A lot of the private shops weren't happy with the co-op, and I can understand why, because the co-op gave dividend, which meant that they had a draw. I mean, today, the supermarkets, they have special offers. We know about Tesco, Asda, Morrison's, and Sainsbury's. They have special offers to try and drag people in. And at the moment, they're having special offers on vegetables. It could be something else. It could be chicken next week. But the co-op didn't have special offers as such in the 30s. They gave a good dividend. And so that was probably the rivalry that you got. But the amazing thing is, a lot of lads who left the co-op bought their own shops. So they were then competing with their previous employer.
Okay, and then sort of specifically about the shop where you worked, what was the layout?
The shops, well, the thing is, the layouts of the shop were very similar. I won't say they were as similar as today. You can go into some of the big supermarkets in one town and you go into the next town and it's laid out exactly the same. You find the flowers there first and then you fruit and veg and so on and so forth. But the layout, we've got to remember that these shops were, quite a number were purpose-built, but a number was second-hand property that they'd adapted for the shop. Central heating, I can only remember one or two shops in Bolton that had central heating. We used to have a pot-bellied stove in the centre of the shop, which the flower lad, as I was when I started there, had to light every morning during the winter. And they could be a pain to light, actually. You had to take all the ashes out and the clinker is like a piece of cork that's sort of set solid with the heat of the fire. You had to take all these out and then you laid it with paper, wood and coke on the top. And one of the big problems with these, some mornings you couldn't get a draft, consequently the fire wouldn't light, and it could take you up to 2 hours to get this thing going. And it was a big pain, that, because you couldn't get on with your other work properly until you got the fire going, because I'm talking about wartime and just after the war, most of the shops were staffed by women then, until the men came back from serving in the forces. And I'm sorry to say the ladies used to complain when the fire wasn't going inside 10 minutes. You could always tell when the fire was going because the shop cat used to lie in front of it. So that was a good indicator that the fire had got going.
And so how many staff were there and what were the different roles, and was there a progression? Sort of
there was, yeah. Actually, a progression was dead man's shoes at the co-op in those days. You had to wait until somebody left before you moved up in rank. I set off as a flour lad. Obviously the name comes from the lad who wakes flour. We used to wake flour and potatoes and dried peas. And I always wonder why the lad weighed dry peas and they weren't on what we call the making up gang. The making up gang were a number of people that used to weigh and wrap other things, because during and after the war, very few things were pre-packed, so they had to be weighed. And as I say, I used to wonder why the lad used to weigh peas, because it didn't seem right, until I dropped my first bag of peas, and then I realised why. The lad, it used to take you weeks to find all the peas that you dropped on the floor. They bounced all over the place. And the shop, we were talking about staffing the shop. Usually it all depended how big the shop was. I worked at Vernon Street, and we had 9 people in staffing the shop. Pre-war, it would be 8 men and 1 lady, who would be, as I said before, the fecky girl. But obviously during the war, it was mainly the manager, who normally was a man during the war. Later on, ladies became managers, and what we call the second shopman, who was the assistant manager. And the progression was, when a manager retired, the second shopman, who was sort of top of the list in line, he would go managing. If a manager sort of retired at a bigger shop, which Vernon Street, where I worked, was a bigger shop, they would move a manager up from a smaller shop to fill the vacancy at the bigger shop, and then they would move what we called the top of the list second shopman into managership. And of course, you were a flour lad for up to 4 years. Fortunately, I was 2 years as a flour lad, and then I got I got my own checkbook, which meant that I was a counter hand then. And the staff in the shop, as I said, there was 9 in the shop, and they used to divide the staff into 2 halves. I know you can't divide 9 into half, but you have 4 and a 5. Now the 4 would be on what we call the making up gang. And making up was weighing and wrapping all the stuff that needed weighing and wrapping. And Monday, Tuesday, these 4 would do nothing but weigh and wrap. Then on Wednesday, they would start coming onto the counter and serving. As you probably appreciate, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday were quiet days. Thursday, Friday, Saturday were busy days. But if the shop did get busy, the people on the making up gang, say it was Tuesday, they would be drafted in onto the counter so that people wouldn't wait any longer than necessary. And then Thursday, Friday, Saturday, the counters were fully staffed with everything. You might have one of the people who wasn't on the making up gang on the provision counter, and it was his or her job to slice bacon, cut cheese, and serve these. That's saving the rest of the staff the problem of going onto the provision counter. I worked at the Central there with 24 staff. Now that was quite a big shop. The shop was divided into 3 portions. The order side, as we called it, the dry goods side, and the provision side. Now the provision side, the word says, it was bacon, cheese, butter, fats, anything in that line, cooked meats. You bought them at the provision counter. The order counter was purely for people who wanted their orders delivered. They used to take their order books to the counter, they'd be priced up, the person would pay for their order, and the making up gang the order making up gang would get the orders together, and these would go out on a daily basis. The dry goods side was the soap, the tea and tin goods, jams, and so that area was called, as I said, the dry goods section. In those days we used to work a 48-hour week. We used to start Monday 8 till 6. Wednesday was our half day, 8 till 12. Saturday was 8 till 5, and we used to have an hour for lunch, and I think it was roughly 48 hours. If I've got my sums wrong, please forgive me, but it was roughly about 48 hours there.
Okay then, I just wanted, you mentioned sort of working during the war. I wanted to know a bit more about sort of rationing food stamps? Were
Yeah.
there certain foods that became available and then everyone wanted them?
Right,
That sort
well,
of thing?
It's interesting actually, wartime. Everybody had a ration book. There was 4 ration books issued, a pink, a green, a blue and a buff. The pink was for expectant mums because they got an egg extra a week. I know it sounds silly saying this today, they got an egg extra a week and also extra milk. That was the pink one. A green one was for a child under 5, which exactly like the other colours, i.e. blue and buff, except that they didn't have any tea coupons in them because they didn't, I suppose they looked at the child under 5 didn't drink tea, so they couldn't have any tea coupons. The blue books were for children of 5 to 14 and the buff books were for anybody over 14, and they were virtually identical inside. The rationing, it varied during the war. The rations were mainly 2 ounces of butter a week, 4 ounces of margarine a week, 2 ounces of lard a week, or cooking fat, but that dropped to 1.5 ounces after the war finished, believe it or not. 4 ounces of bacon, 1 10p worth of meat. I know that sounds strange, but even within that 1 10p, meat was rationed because it all depended which cut of meat you got. If you got a higher quality cut of meat, you got less meat for your money. If you got shin beef, you got a lot of shin beef for your money. And also, you didn't need to take all 1 10p worth of meat at the same time because people hadn't got fridges in those days. But the butcher would mark your ration book with how much you'd spent. If you'd only spent £1, put £1 in the meat portion of your ration book. Cheese was 2 ounces a week, unless you were a miner or a steel worker, and you got an extra 4 ounces a week. Sugar, that varied. It started off at the beginning of the war at £0.75 a week each, but by the end of the war it had dropped to £0.5 a week. Jam, you were allowed 4 ounces a week, or honey. Obviously you couldn't buy a 4-ounce jar of jam, so you had to take 4 weeks lot of jam in a £1 jam jar. And tea, you were allowed 2 ounces a week, and there's coupons in the book that you cut out. Soap powder, you were allowed the equivalent of, or near the equivalent of 3 ounces of soap or soap powder a week. Sweets, you were allowed 2 ounces a week, and these again were coupons that were inside the ration book, and virtually everything was on ration. Some of the few things that weren't on ration were cereals like barley, lentils and dried peas, but all the other stuff on the shelves were rationed in another way, where in your ration book you had a point system, and if you look at an old ration book you'll see there's A's, B's and C's points. The A's are 1 point each, B's are 2 points each, C's are 2 points each. And the reason you had A, B's and C's, if the country had a glut of food, they could increase one of the A, B's and C's to an extra point. And it seemed a very fair system, but unfortunately the people who lived on their own had a harder time than the bigger families. For instance, you could get what we called an A1 sized tin of peas. That was 2 points. And an A1 sized tin of peas was 2 points, but the smaller tin, the A1 size, was, sorry, I've got confused again. An A1 tall tin of peas was 2 points. The smaller size, A1 size pea, was 2 points. So you got half as many peas again for the same value of points. So a person living on their own couldn't really buy a big tin of peas. So there we go. A tin of salmon, for instance, if you could get grade 1 salmon, that was 20 points, which meant a person living on their own, if they bought a tin of salmon, they couldn't buy anything else off the grocer's shelf for a month. And but the thing is about salmon, it was kept under the counter. Now I don't know the people who understand this phrase, older people will be, but things that were in very short supply were kept under the counter and sold to the better spending customers. For instance, chocolate biscuits would be under the counter, salmon was under the counter, strawberry jam would be under the counter. You could get gooseberry jam, you could get apple and blackberry jam, you could get all the mixed fruit jams, especially fruit that we jam in this country, but things like strawberry and blackcurrant, they were kept under the counter. Simple things like marmalade, ordinary marmalade, no problem, but if you wanted silver shred or golden shred, Robertson's silver shred or golden shred, that would be kept under the counter. Another thing I've not mentioned is all prices were regulated. They were controlled, government controlled, so it didn't matter whether you bought half a pound of tea at the Co-op or at the biggest grocer in town or at the corner shop. It was exactly the same price. Everything was the same price. Some foods were subsidised as well. For instance, an 8-ounce packet of cornflakes, I think the price was 7p in old money, which is about 3p, but it was 2 points. I say cornflakes, so you couldn't get cornflakes during the war. They were known as wheat flakes during the war, and so everything virtually had a points value on them. Coming back to the sweets, you had D and E coupons, and each, whether it was a D or an E, was worth 1 ounce. And I think the reason again for the 2 letters was if we had lots of sweets, they could make one of the D's or E's 2 ounces or whatever. Cheese was, you could only get 2 qualities of cheese. You could get Canadian cheddar, which is hard as a tabletop, or you could get American processed, which you could bounce like a rubber ball. And they were controlled. The price of cheese in those days was only a penny a pound during the war. And bacon, you couldn't get the lovely bacon that we got today. It was very fatty bacon, and you didn't have a choice. You had to take what the grocer had got. And that was virtually, sugar. Sugar, everybody of the older generation will remember the blue bags that sugar used to be in. If you wanted a bit of extra sugar and you weren't bothered about your jam, you could have a pound of sugar for your jam ration. So we used to call it sugar for jam.
Okay. I just wanted to get a bit more of an idea about how often things were delivered. Was there sort of a set day that certain things were delivered? Or?
Yeah. Well, deliveries, you had deliveries not every day. Obviously bread was delivered every day, and all the bread in those days was unwrapped and unsliced. There was no sliced bread during the war, and we used to use tissue paper to wrap the bread up. That used to come fresh every morning by horse and cart. Strange as it may sound today, but it was a horse and cart that used to bring the bread. Deliveries, it all depended which shop you were at, on which day you got your main delivery of goods. And again, the shops nearer to the warehouse in Bow Street in Bolton, they were delivered by horse and cart. The Nine District, shall we say, Astley Bridge and Belmont and Four Lane Edis, they would be delivered by motor wagon. And you get one big delivery a week, and then possibly a couple of small top-up orders during the week. Most of the deliveries, we've got to remember that there wasn't the lot of food that we have today, so half the shelves were empty, or we used to face them up, and facing up is actually putting a row of packets at the front of the shelf so it looks full. And if you go in supermarkets today, I was in Morrison's only yesterday, and they did a bit facing up. Obviously, they were waiting for a delivery of certain things, and they brought the packets to the front. Another thing that we had to do was to take the old out and put the new at the back. For instance, if it was raisins or anything, lard, margarine, anything that we had no sell-by dates in those days, but anything that could go off, we would bring to the front and put all the new at the back. But usually when the wagon came with the main order, it was everybody helping out to pack the stuff into the shelves. And you hadn't a storeroom as such. You might have one or two things upstairs that wouldn't go in, but very, very little.
So what was a sort of a typical working day? You know, what were your hours of work?
Right, well, typical day, if I start off as a flower lad, probably that, because you have more variance of jobs as a flower lad. The first thing I used to do when I came into the shop was sweep the floor. And we used to get a bucket, fill it with sawdust, and then saturate the sawdust, and then throw it onto the floor before we swept the shop. That was to lay the dust, because you could get quite a lot of dust. That was in when you were sweeping up. And after you swept up, you would then put some fresh sawdust down behind the counters where the assistants were working. That was just to soak up any grease or whatever was on the floor. But in winter, of course, I've mentioned the pot-bellied stove. Your first job was to light the stove. Then, of course, a winter's day, I'd lit the stove. I'd then swept the floor. The next thing on a Monday was to weigh the flour. But in the meantime, the bread may come, so the lad had to look after the bread and put it away in what we call the fixtures, the shelves. And also the lad, if any wagons came with any goods, he had to look after them as well. So whilst you're doing your normal day's job, you also had to drop that job and see to wagons or things like that. But as I say, Monday, the first job we did was to weigh the flour, hence the name flour lad. And in the shops, in those days, the ceilings were quite high. They could be up to 14 or 15 feet high. We had metal bins that came from the upstairs down to floor level, and they had a U-bend at the bottom. And what we used to do with the lid on, you put the lid down and we go upstairs, and we used to call it shooting. What it meant was emptying how many bags of flour we were going to weigh up that particular day. You might empty 3 bags of flour. We used to call them half loads, because in the grocery trade, a load is a weight, like a hundredweight. It is 280 pounds. So half loads were 140. We'd drop those down, and then we'd weigh in pounds, 2 pounds, 3 pounds, 6 pounds, and so on. Whilst we're doing this, we're expected to weigh potatoes if anybody wanted potatoes, and also to measure vinegar, because the vinegar was loose. We used to sell loose vinegar, half pints and pints. We also had to look after the bleach. The lad looked after the bleach bottles. We had ozone and other bleaches that we had to look after. And this is all whilst you're trying to weigh your flour and then weigh your dried peas, after which I've mentioned. And the bottles, the boss used to keep his eye on you, the manager used to keep his eye on you. So you had to be careful you didn't break any bottles, even if they were empty, because they were worth a penny. Because we used to charge a halfpenny on certain bottles. For instance, jam jars, a pound jam jar, there was a halfpenny charge on it, a £2 jam jar, a penny charge on it. So if you broke a jam jar, although it was empty, you used to get a little bit of trouble from the manager for like wasting money. And of course, when you've made your flour up and your peas, if you finished, you used to then, the lad would go helping the making up gang. That would be Monday. Then Tuesday, the lad's job was similarly, you swept the floor, lit the fire, swept the floor, but then you had to sweep and clean what we call the back shop, i.e. the rooms at the back of the shop and the upstairs. You used to sweep those out, and again, if any wagons came, you had to break off what you were doing, and see to the wagons. And also, if you were in the shop, you were expected to weigh potatoes if you were there. Obviously, if you weren't there, the assistant themselves used to weigh potatoes. Another main job of the lad was to was to pack when they came as well. And it was always the lad's job to pack the soap in, and that was a job and a half, because the soap in those days was unwrapped, and it was sticky and slippery, and it wouldn't stay still, and you'd find you piled all the soap nicely under the counter, and it'd all slip, and that was it. And virtually that was the daily routine. I used to clean the windows. we used to clean the windows outside. We used to take a bowl of water and the sweeping brush, and we dipped the brush into the water, and we used to brush the windows with the water. And when we give them a good brushing, we used to get a bowl of fresh water and get the pint vinegar measure and swill the water from the pint vinegar measure. We used to throw the water over there, and they used to come out clean and no streaks. I can't understand why, but they did.
And what was the working week? Were you open? I assume you weren't open Sundays, but were you open?
No, we weren't open Sundays. As I said before, our hours were between 8 and 6, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, 8 till 6, Friday, 8 till 7, Wednesday, 8 till 12, and Saturday, 8 till 5. And then we had an hour for dinner.
Okay then.
My first week's wage at the Co-op was £1.12 and sixpence.
Okay then, so now we're going to move on to the equipment used
Right.
during your time at the Co-op. So what did you sort of, we've got a few pictures here of weighing scales and
Right,
packaging. What was the sort of different packaging and
Yep.
scales that you used?
Thank you. Well, these are beam scales. I'm looking at a photograph of beam scales where you have 2 plates on an arm, this arm, one at each end of the arm. On one plate you put the weight, £1, £2 or ounces or whatever, and on the other you put the actual commodity you're weighing. And actually the correct way to weigh is to make sure that the 2 things balance. And on these scales there is an arrow in the centre, and that arrow, to give the customer perfect weight, the arrow must point straight to the top of the scale. If it points towards the weight itself, the customer is being shortchanged. If it points to the commodity, the shop is losing money. And we use beam scales for most things, but on the provision side we used automatic scales, which have a chart at the front. The one I'm looking at just has a chart, but you could buy them with a ready reckoner on. Consequently, when you put the item on, say half a pound of bacon, it was just overweight, the scales would tell you how much it was at whatever, 2 and 3 a pound or half a crown a pound. It would tell you. Some of the scales had scoops on, which you use potatoes and vegetables, or coffee, for instance, and things like that. Other scales were flat, where you were just weighing, shall we say, butter and margarine, things that wouldn't sort of spill all over the floor. Automatic scales were usually used on the provision counter, whilst the beam scales were used by what I've said, the making up gang. Electronic scales hadn't come in whilst I was working at the Co-op, although virtually every scale now is electronic. The scales were checked regularly, and it was the flour lad's job to carry the weights, and it was quite a job, down to town to the weights and measures office. And the weights, they had to be stamped by the weights and measures office to make sure they were 100% correct. And also we used to get the weights and measures inspectors coming on a sort of semi-regular basis, probably about every 9 months, to check that the scales were wrong. If the scales were wrong, they would condemn them straight away. But usually, most shops, even the private shops, had a contract with Avery's or another scale manufacturer, and they would be out immediately, so the scales weren't out of action for long. The other things we used, obviously, I mentioned flour. The bags of flour had to be taken up to the 2nd floor. Consequently, we had a hoist, and thank you. We had a hoist. This was hand-driven. What happened would, if you look at any old Co-op shop, you will see a hole in the wall, probably bricked up today, but there used to be 2 wooden doors there, and you open these wooden doors inwardly, and then you sent out a jib or an arm out into the street, and on the arm would be a rope. You'd lower this rope, and then you'd have to wind whatever was on the rope up to the second floor. Normally, if it was sugar, say a 200 weight bag of sugar, you'd make like a ball in the corner of sugar, in the sugar bag, if you can understand what I'm saying, the corner, and then you could get your rope around that ball and hoist the sugar up. And you'd hoist it up to floor level and then drag it in. The hoists were quite heavy work, but they were low geared, but there was no electric motors in those days, so it was all hand driven. And the one thing that we used to do, which was totally against the rules and regulations, but I think I can tell you now after so long, if you pulled whatever you had on, say you had 200 weight bags of sugar, you'd hoist it up, and if you pulled them in very quickly and took the brake off the actual hoist itself, the impetus and the weight of the sugar would take it right to the other side of the room, which meant that you hadn't to truck it. It was already at the other side of the room. But if you didn't get the brake off, the sugar would shoot out, as it did on one occasion, shoot out, back outside, and the sacks would just tear by the sheer weight of the sugar. And I remember we had 400 weight of sugar emptied itself down onto the street. And sugar was rationed at half a pound a head in those days, and the manager was none too pleased that we'd got 400 weight of sugar all over the floor. Anyway, this sugar was swept up, sent back to Tate & Lyle's, re-refined, and we got it back. So more or less that was, other than the brush shovel and mopping buckets, that was all the sort of machinery that we had in the shops.
Just going back to the scales, were the customers sort of, did you ever have any disputes with the customers? Did they tend to prefer the automatic or the...
No, they in fact the thing is, it was more like, at the Co-op it was more like serving family. The strange thing, I'm coming back to answer your question, but the strange thing was that you all had your own customers. You didn't pick them. They seemed to just come to you, and you might have, or your assistant, your colleague next door might have 3 people waiting for him, and you say, right, I'm ready to serve you. Oh no, we'll wait for such a body. And it was the same. Everybody seemed to have their own set of customers. So actually, coming back to your question about the scales, very rarely did you have any query from the customer about the scales or how you weighed things. You might have somebody joking, saying, oh, you're a bit light-handed with that, with those potatoes or whatever, because customers like to see the scale line with the potatoes or whatever it was go bang down. But this was one of the reasons, way back in the early days before the Rochdale Pioneers, a lot of the co-ops started and went to the wall because they were giving people 18 ounces of sugar instead of 16 ounces and only charging them 16 ounces. So as far as weighing is concerned, the customers were pretty trustworthy, put it that way.
So just going to move on to sort of the social side of working at the Co-op. You've already described sort of the sense of community. Were there any social events?
Yes, there were actually. There was the Bolton Co-op Heritage Society used to, they organised a lot of events for holidays, for instance. They'd organise coach trips, or charabancs as we used to call them before the war. But also in the shops, the managers used to have what we called a manager's picnic, where they went away for a couple of days. The second shop men, or assistant managers, they used to have theirs. And the rest of the people, who we used to call the odds and sods, they had their picnics once a year, and usually it was a trip to Pilling, have a bowling competition at Pilling, then on to Blackpool for our tea. But there were other social events that happened. For instance, the Co-op had its own football team, and in those days we had a Wednesday afternoon league, and the Co-op in Bolton used to play on Holy Harbour in Hallowell, and you could go and play football. That's if you were good enough. I was never good enough to play for the Co-op, but there we go. And other social events like that. There might be a tea dance. Well, I'm saying a tea dance. There was tea dances every week for members of the Cooperative Society, but they'd have an annual dinner dance for the people who worked at the co-op, all the employees. So there were social events going on. The thing was that it was quite amazing in one sense, because most of the people who worked at the co-op you didn't know, because they used to divide Bolton up into areas. And I, coming from Astley, I would be, if you looked at the clock face, and that was Bolton, and Astley was 12 o'clock. Tonmore would be 10 past 12, and Hallowell would be 10 to 12. And those, I could work by virtue of coming in Astley in those three areas. But I wouldn't work at somewhere at 6 o'clock, which is the other side of town, unless I worked at the Central, which was right in the middle. Then that was the only time that you met people from the other side of town. So actually, you were sort of in what can I say? You were kept in a confined area. You may occasionally go on to the other side of town, but very, very rarely. As I say, they apportion town into sections there.
You mentioned there were sort of separate picnics for management and things. Was there a sense of us and them? Did you try and get away with things maybe? Or?
No, there wasn't any sense, really and truly. We all worked as a team. Obviously, we respected the manager and the second shopman, very much so. The second shopman was like the, what do they call him today in industry? He was the man that kept the peace between the staff and the manager. It all depended. There were good managers and bad managers. There were managers that people could get away with things, and there were other managers that were very keen, as it is today. But the second shopman, he was like the troubleshooter, that was the word I was searching for, between us and them, if you will. But in overall, usually you found the managers were part and parcel of the staff. Yeah. Mm.
Okay. So sort of during your time with the co-op, was the training sort of learning on the job, or was there any kind of force?
Yeah. The actual training was extremely good. Anybody who had been trained as a grocer at the co-op was a grocer at the end of the thing. We also had night school, of course. I used to go to night school 3 nights a week. The co-op had its own night school. I didn't go to the co-op night school. I went to the, well, not private, but the public night school, like the local technical college. The reason was that your horizons are narrowed if you went to the co-op night school, because it was co-op, whereas you wanted to learn other things. For instance, it doesn't matter today, we will learn which was the best raisins. If a case of raisins used to be wooden boxes, £56, if that came into the shop and it had 1 crown on, that was a very poor quality raisin. If it had 5 crowns on the side, that was top quality. Usually, if it was sultanas, that would be from Australia. And we were taught where the commodities came from, where the best tea was grown, so on and so forth. Whereas today, it's in a packet. It doesn't really matter if the customer's happy with the price and the quality. It doesn't matter where it came from. So the training was quite good. And as you saw earlier, I wrapped ½ pound of raisins in a flat piece of paper. But the end product was okay, but had that been my end product when I worked at the co-op, it would have been empty and I had to rewrap it, because they had to be virtually square and all the same size. So yeah, it was very good quality training. We were taught to bone bacon, because obviously that is part and parcel of your job. When you sort of get to the position of second shopman, the second shopman always boned the bacon. Although all the lads in the shop could bone bacon, but it was his job to bone and roll the bacon. And of course, as I say, you had to know about the qualities of cheese, although during the war it didn't really matter, you only got 2 qualities. But all these things you were taught, and went to night school and finished up with a certificate of one kind of another. Yeah, the training was very good.
You've already touched quite a lot on this, but sort of, was there a specific type of person that shopped at the co-op, and did this change during your time there?
In the main, you found, Bolton, well, I'm going back to the 30s and 40s. You find people on Chorley Road, which was the quality side of Bolton, they would probably go to the high-class shops in town. The working class people would go to they'd use the corner shops as top-up shops, really. But most of the working class people will go to the co-op or to one of the local chain stores, i.e. Tate's and Blowers, to buy the stuff. Really and truly, there seems to be more rivalry today than there was then, although there was more stores then. But people I think they were more satisfied where they went to shop. Whereas today, I may be talking through my hat a little bit, because you find that a Tesco customer is always a Tesco customer for some reason or other. In the main, they're 100% Tesco, and we've got some friends who are 100% Sainsbury. Ourselves, we go to Morrison's because it's the nearest of the lot. And also you've got the Aldi's and the Lidl's of this world, and they're well supported by a certain section of the people, you know. It's very difficult to really answer the question honestly, except the co-op seem to have a pull, a draw, by virtue of you got something back, whereas you didn't get it from the other shops.
By that you mean the dividend?
The dividend, yes.
So
yeah.
Sort of I think with the modern supermarkets, you get loyalty cards, don't you? You earn your points.
Well, that's right. Yeah. Tesco give a loyalty card, and Sainsbury's they have one. I've forgotten the name of it. A Nectar, theirs is. Morrison's don't give anything. Asda have if you have their credit card, you can get your petrol tuppence a gallon cheaper or something like that, tuppence a litre cheaper. But I don't know whether. I would imagine that Tesco's do. In fact, Tesco's are just using the same things that the co-op did. Actually, they're giving a dividend, but in a different kind of way. You do get a cash voucher at the end of 3 months or whatever, which is the dividend that you've accumulated on your card.
So then, sort of reflecting on your overall time, you worked there for nearly 10 years?
That's right.
What sort of changes did you see?
Well, the thing is, whilst I was there, we saw the input of self-service, and the co-op were leaders in the country in self-service and in supermarkets. They were the first, they were forerunners of all the major supermarket chains in supermarkets and in self-service shops. And I can recall that the first self-service shop in Bolton, it was talked about a lot. People weren't sure whether they liked it or not, whereas it's second nature today to serve yourself. We saw that, and then as time went on and as people got more on the feet, we got more pre-packed stuff in. You hadn't to weigh as many things because they came in packets. Things became more readily available on the paper side, like packaging, and so that side of the equation sort of died, and then of course I can recall the first supermarket in Bolton opening. I went to work in there for a little while, and it was quite a job stacking all the goods on these. Sometimes you don't realise how much stuff there is in a shop until you've got to fill an empty shop, and then you realise just what's in there. So we saw the coming of, over those 9 years I worked at the co-op, we saw the coming of self-service and supermarkets, and as I said before, the co-op were forerunners in this instance.
And you did touch on it, so how did your customers react to it? Did they like
Apprehensive is probably the initial word, not knowing what to do, feeling that they're stealing, and I didn't mean that as a pun, but what I mean, taking things off them shelves themselves and putting it in a basket. The only thing is that pilfering increased with self-service. If you saw a customer sort of taking too long in the shop at certain areas, you kept your eye on them. Not that you're being, well, you are, you're not trusting them. But normally, a lot of people give the game away if they're after putting something in the shopping bag rather than in the shop basket, you see. And so the pilfering did increase with the coming of self-service. But there we go. I have to pay for pilfering in the price we pay.
So then again, reflecting on your time at the Co, what was your reason for leaving, and when was it?
Well, as I said before, I left primarily because of the wage. As I said, I can remember as a lad, people were saying, oh, they've got on at the council or they've got on at the co-op. They're made for life. It was sort of a lifetime's job. You started at the council or the co-op at 14 or 15 or whatever, and you stayed there till you were 65. Well, times have changed. People don't go for a job for a lifetime, or very few do today. And I left in 1953 or 54, I'm not too sure. And I remember the manager said to me, no, I was assistant manager in those days. And in those days, as I say, managers were dead men's shoes. Today it isn't. It's the best man for the job gets the manager's job. Whereas in those days, it was just by seniority that you got the job. And I remember the second shopman said to me, Norman, I don't know why you're working here. Why don't you go up to De Havilland, where they're getting better money? And I thought about it, although I still enjoy, even going into a supermarket today, I still have that grocer's thoughts behind me of what's going on, you know, how they're displaying things and how they're conning people into buying more than they should buy, you know, and so on and so forth. I left the co-op, talked to my manager, and I got a job at De Havilland, and within 2 weeks I was earning 10 shillings a week more than the manager was at that shop. So that was the difference between working in private industry and working at the co-op at that time. And I finished up in the cost office at De Havilland, and then I moved on from there.
So then, what were your favourite things, or what did you enjoy most about working for the co-op?
The thing I did enjoy most was serving customers, meeting the customers. Friendly atmosphere. You could always have a joke with the customers. Obviously, you had to know the customer before you could sort of pull the leg or whatever. But in the main, you soon got to know customers. They soon got to know you, and you found if they were joking with you, you sort of made it. Can I put it that way? And I said before, it was a very happy place to work for. It was. You worked hard. You didn't have much spare time. You worked hard, but it was happy. The atmosphere was happy, and I was sorry to leave, really, but there we go. Progress.
Okay, so we're going to move on to some more sort of general questions about what you've done for entertainment over your lifetime. So when you were growing up, what were the sorts of things you did for entertainment? You mentioned playing sports.
Well, yes. Well, obviously, as you get up into your late teens, you find out there's such a thing as girls as well, don't you? When you get a bit older, and the same thing happens the opposite way. Girls find out there's boys. It was funny, and I'll just digress for a moment. I went to a brass band concert only 3 weeks ago, listening to Wingate's brass band, and the president was telling us during the actual concert that it's an excellent band, and they have a tremendous number of young people in until they get 17 or 18, and then the boys find out there's girls, and girls find out there's boys, and they lose their members. And so I suppose as it got into the teens, we used to go into temperance bars in our spare time, go to the pitches, the local pitches, picture place, as we called it, the little picture theatre. But then at weekend it would be going dancing at the Palais. But prior to going to the Palais, if you're a 16-year-old, there'd be Sunday school dances that you go to on Saturday evening. And then, as I say, you get older, you go to the Palais. And then, of course, every Saturday, round about 1958, 59 and thereabouts, the British Rail used to, for 5 shillings, you could get a return ticket to Blackpool on Saturday evening. That included a entrance to the Tower Ballroom or the Winter Gardens, so that was quite a draw. And of course, holidays, we used to look forward to holidays. We'd not actually fled the nest, but we'd sort of dispense with our mothers and fathers for holidays, and we went with our mates. So there were some of the things we used to do. Also, I used to enjoy walking as well. Of course, we've already mentioned prior to this, going to watch the Wanderers. I used to go to watch Astlevich Cricket Club, Lancashire Cricket Club. And so there was quite a lot to do in those days. You were never at a loss of what to do. Although there was very little television, you'd only BBC One right at the beginning, then ITV came later and BBC Two. So there was a lot of activities, a lot of things to do. And if you were involved in a church, you'd even more things to do, because unfortunately now, with a lot of the church closing and getting smaller, a lot of the activities like Scouts, Guides, Boys Brigade, they've all finished. Consequently, the young people today, they can't, even if they didn't enjoy them, they just can't have the advantage of them as we have.
So you mentioned going to sort of Blackpool. Did you ever venture into Manchester, or which places did you make an effort?
Right. Well, I was rather parochial actually. It's a bit of a laugh. I'm still parochial now. I lost my way here this morning, and we're only 12 miles away from here. And as I said this morning, I only worked 300 yards from the railway station, and but it's all altered so much. I just didn't recognise it. We did go to Wigan Empress on Saturday night. Oh, it's fallen out. Sorry.
Whenever you're ready. Wigan Empress.
Okay. We would go to Blackpool some Saturdays, and other Saturdays we go to Wigan Empress. We used to enjoy that. There'd be 4 or 5 lads of us. In fact, we used to go to Wigan Empress more than Bolton Palais, really. We'd do Bolton Palais during the week, say Wednesday night, and go to Wigan Empress. One of the reasons we went to Wigan Empress was it was a better band, and we used to enjoy ourselves, and we had a sort of a little train ride to Wigan and back, and so that was the place we used to go. Also, we'd ride our bikes to Southport. We never went farther than Southport. I used to be all in by the time I got to Southport, but we'd go there as well. But other than that, we didn't stray out of Bolton really a great deal. We used to spend most of our time in town. A little bit different than our grandchildren now. They're always in Manchester. They spend more time in here. They said it's alive. It's the bee's knees really.
So then, can you tell me what the Bolton holidays were?
Right. Well, Bolton holidays. It was the last Friday in June was the start of Bolton holidays. We never called them Waits Weeks in Bolton. They're always known as Bolton holidays or September holidays. We used to have, originally, before the war and just after the war, we had only 1 week's holiday at the end of June. And then as time went on, we got 2 weeks holiday with pay. But we used to have 3 days at September, which became a week. Now they've all been done away with, and now we have the sort of national annual holiday mid-July to the end of August, and so on and so forth. But Bolton holidays were always an exciting time, and coming back to the Co-op divvy, the reason that we could go on holiday was that my mother would spend the dividend on the holiday. There wouldn't be enough for the whole of the holiday, but there would be a goodly portion of going on holiday. Going on family holidays, we used to go and get digs or rooms at boarding houses in Blackpool or Rill. They were the 2 favourites. We have been to New Brighton near Liverpool, But Blackpool or Row were the two favourites, and we'd book in for a week, and in those days you sort of looked after yourself, a sort of self-catering, but the landlady used to cook your food for you. You used to go out every day, buy the meat or the fish or whatever, leave it with the landlady, and she'd cook it for you. And there would be a sideboard in the dining room, and you would be allocated a portion of the sideboard for your own cruet, i.e. salt and pepper, and your cornflakes and so on, and that'd be yours. There may be two other families with an area in the sideboard for their things. Obviously, it used to be, we used to just rent rooms. We couldn't afford full board, a half board, or even bed and breakfast. The money wouldn't allow it. But it was a happy time, and as I've said before, the majority of people were in the same boat, so you didn't realise how poor you were. You didn't realise all the poverty around you. I know the big thrill was going on the sands, and I can remember going, getting the suitcases. One thing that my dad used to do, he used to go up to the police station to tell them we're going away, because in those days the police had time to come and check your door. If they were on the beat, they would check that your door in your house was okay. And then the last job to do was turn off the gas, the water and electricity, and then take your suitcases round. Didn't get a taxi in those days, you went round to the tram or bus stop, and there would be a queue of people with suitcases. And I can remember it was quite a jolly time. We had conductors on the trams and buses in those days, and you used to put your suitcases under the staircase, but there'd be too many suitcases to be under the staircase and they'd be all over the platform. But the conductor never seemed to bother. He used to be in a happy frame of mood, and he would climb over these suitcases to collect his fares. We got to Bolton station, and you'd have hundreds of people coming from all parts of Bolton, milling around the centre of the station, long queues to get on the platform. And then I used to get this tremendous thrill when I could smell the smell of oil and steam from the steam engines coming in, and the clank of the driving rod as it came in. And then of course, again, as I got older, we used to go, as lads, we used to go to Isle of Man and enjoy the sail across and time at the Isle of Man. It was mainly the Isle of Man. Holidays abroad, other than the Isle of Man, weren't sort of for the more poorer classes in those days, you know. Torquay was even a posh place in those days, you know. Yeah.
So, sort of moving to modern day, what do you think of the entertainment that's on offer now, sort of around Greater Manchester?
Well, the thing is that we don't go out all that often. It is amazing now to go to the theatre and to the cinema and not have to queue, and you've got about 10 or 12 films that you can go and see. In our day, of course, we used to go to the local cinema, and cinemas were graded in those days. 1 or A were the big London cinemas that got the films straight away, they'd come off the press. The second class, or B, were the provincial big cinemas, Liverpool and Manchester. C would be the Bolton big cinemas, D would be the local cinemas, and the fifth category would be what they're commonly known, the bug huts. And actually, in those days, the films weren't issued to all the towns at the same time. London had them first, then the big cities had them, then the towns had them, then the districts had them, then the bug huts had them, and it may be 2 years before a film got down to the lower quality cinema, and the film would be all scratched and marks and pop marks and all that. Whereas today, if a film's issued, virtually all the cinemas, the big cinema complexes, have them at the same time. There may be a preview in London, but in the main, they'll come at the same time. And so today, we just, our priorities on leisure have changed. We do watch television quite a lot, have half an hour on the computer, a bit of grey surfing they call it, don't they, silver surfing. And of course there's, today, the grandchildren. You look after the grandchildren. You do a bit of babysitting and enjoy your time with the grandchildren. Holidays have changed now. We do get abroad rather than... We do take local holidays. In fact, we just come back from the Cotswolds. But the price of holidays to go abroad now is well within majority of people's purses. And so on the holiday side, we tend to go abroad now rather than the main holiday at home.
Okay then, and do you remember when you got your first television and sort of what was it like?
Yes, I can remember the first television coming. You had to have an H aerial in those days. The modern television aerials, you never saw them at all. It was just a big H, and it was about, I think when it was on the chimney, it was fastened to the chimney, and it was about 5 or 6 foot high, just a letter H, about 4 foot wide and 5 or 6 foot high. And I can remember getting our first television set. It was a 10-inch picture, which was from corner to corner, so it was a very small picture. And the television set was an Ambassador, made in Yorkshire. And I remember it coming, and fortunately, or unfortunately, there was only one other television in our street. So we were sort of it was a bit of a, what shall I say, we were quite posh having a television, although for entertainment, my mum and dad didn't spend a lot of money on entertainment, so that's why they went for this television. And I can remember the screen was very small, and we got it in I'm not sure, it was about 1950s. I'm not sure on the year, but I can recall that we had this television. I worked at the Co-op, and a Wednesday afternoon, England were playing. I think they were playing Scotland on this Wednesday afternoon, or Wales, one of their home countries. And 12 lads from the shop came to our house to watch this match on a very small television set with the oohs and ahs and shoot and what have you going. And to make the television larger, you could buy magnifiers, and these were probably about 18 inches across by a foot deep, and you put it in front of your television set and it made the picture look bigger. But it was all black and white, and it wasn't until much later that we got the coloured televisions, of course.
And what are your memories sort of local television, sort of Granada, Coronation Street, programmes like that?
Well, Coronation Street, I was working actually in Salford, believe it or not, at this time, when Coronation Street first came on the television. And of course, originally it was filmed in Salford. In fact, Granada Studios, we're nearly in Salford anyway. Most of the things that's called Manchester are in Salford, really, Salford Docks, or Manchester Docks and so on. But I remember I worked in Salford, and we had quite a number of Salford people, and they were all like, excited about this new programme that was only on for 6 weeks, 50 years ago. It was only coming on for a 6-week period, and I think virtually the country stopped to watch Coronation Street in those days, and with not Hilda Baker, I'm sorry I've forgotten the names of the people, but the original cast. And I think in those days, she had some drama, you had a lot of comedy in it as well, more humour than today. And we used to enjoy watching the news, but it wasn't news as we get it today. It was more like a magazine programme in those days. You might have something that happened 3 or 4 weeks ago, might have happened in Canada or whatever. It was more like a magazine programme rather than up to date. I mean, even today, when the Iraq War was on, we saw these missiles passing the hotel. Actually, at the time they were passing the hotel, whereas in those days you had to wait for, the information coming through.
Just going back to Coronation Street a little bit, was it fairly unusual to see something that kind of represented where you were from on television? Or?
No, I think it was very factual, actually. The thing is, you could relate to the characters there. Not as much as it can relate to the characters now. I mean, it's more gruesome today. I don't watch EastEnders because I cut my throat, I think, if I watched that more than 3 times. No, forgive me for saying that. It's good acting, but some of the storylines, there's so much, what can I say, hatred in it, in a sense, and falling out. And I think this is what we don't need. We want cheering up when things are bad, but there we go. And this is what with Coronation Street. You could relate to the characters in Coronation Street. We've all met characters as they were in those days. I'm not saying that people have changed and the characters that they're depicting today aren't like today's characters, but at least it was like the people next door when you're watching Coronation Street. You knew these ladies that knew it all. You know, you got neighbours like that, and so you may have been like that yourself as well. I'm not pointing fingers at other people, but I think this is why Coronation Street went down so well, because you could relate to each one of the characters. You know, I can't remember the names now, but I think this is why, if I may just digress from television, Have a Go Joe was a radio programme that majority of people listened to because they could relate to the people who were on the programme, you know, and it's like a bit like, if you heard Al Reid's comedy, an old comedian, people could relate to what he was saying, and you seem to enjoy it to something more that you can relate to than what you can't do, you know. I feel that television, unfortunately, for me, it's gone the wrong way. But I think we've been brainwashed into accepting things that 20 years ago, in the days of Mary Whitehouse, they wouldn't have been accepted, whereas today we just take it as it comes and that's it. Occasionally somebody will slip up, I'll not mention any names, but somebody will slip up and there's a bit of hoo-ha about it. But that's only for about 4 weeks and then we're back to square one again, you know. Now I think it was more family orientated, the television in its early days, especially Coronation Street. You know, Jack and Hilda and all these people having friendly falling out do's, which happens in every household, you know.
Okay then, brilliant. So we're just going to move finally onto the food industry.
Yeah.
So what sort of food or drink products would you associate with Greater Manchester, the Bolton area, and why?
Well, I don't know. The thing is, social lives have changed actually. I'm sorry to say that Bolton in the evening, especially at weekend, is a no-go area. You won't find many elderly people in Bolton town centre in these days. I think the licensing hours are a little bit too long. I think 24-hour drinking is wrong. Not because people want to drink 24 hours, but for the people who don't drink and just want a quieter life. I think the streets in the evening are not safe. I don't know about Manchester. I don't know a lot about Manchester. As I've said, our eldest grandchildren, they come to Manchester, they think it's the end thing, it's the bee's knees, and in fact, our eldest grandson, he was at Manchester University, and whilst he's living in Bolton, he still comes over to Manchester. I think Manchester's his town now there. He still supports Bolton Wanderers, but as far as the city's concerned, and people are entertained by different things today than we were. We seem to have simple things that entertain us, whereas today I go out, I know this may sound strange, but I go out for a meal and I've only just got up to £5 for a meal in my brain, whilst I know it's going to cost me £10. I've slowly gone up the ladder. I went from £2.50 to £3.50. Now I'm at £5, although it's costing me £10. And when I see the young people going out and it only we went out, it was only £25, and I cringe. I think, well, I live over a week on £25. You know what I mean? So really and truly, coming back to present day living, as an older person, I don't think I could cope with that kind of life really. But the young people, they've been brought up to it, and I should imagine that our parents, when we did things in our teens, our parents would say, we couldn't do that, you know, and these teenagers today, when their children or grandchildren come along and they start doing things, the same thing will happen, won't it, you know.
So would you say is there any sort of specific products? The one I've got down here is Vimto.
Oh right, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Things like that, or types of food.
Well, sorry, I did digress a little bit there. If I'm going back to my early days, of course, fish and chips were the main thing that you bought in those days. I know now you might have 10 different countries' national dishes in a row of shops. But fish and chips and tripe was a very big food in Bolton. In fact, the turn of the 1900s, there was 69 tripe shops in Bolton, i.e. the main thing they sold was tripe. You went to that shop for tripe and nothing else. Well, possibly other things, but mainly tripe. Whereas eating habits have changed tremendously. Majority of people don't sit around a table today. They have sandwiches or the meal on the knee while they're watching television. Fortunately, my wife and myself have always kept, if anybody comes for a meal, especially the grandchildren, we sit around the table and always have done. We feel that that's the place that you can exchange notes and empty your hearts and what have you around a table, and it's quite good. Coming back to food, Vimto was quite a big pop, it was said, and all the old traditional dandelion and burdock was another thing. Cream soda, American cream soda was another. Sarsaparilla, you bought these in gallon jars, stone jars, and I remember there used to be a shilling deposit on the stone jar. And in fact, those stone jars, the poorer people used them for hot water bottles during the winter. Although there's a notice on the jar itself, these are not to be used for any other purpose but this. But they used to, I know at the court we used to sell more stone bottles of pop in September than any other time of the year, and we used to take more empties back in April than any other time of the year, because in the 6 months between those two dates, they've been used as hot water bottles. It saved people buying a hot water bottle.
So, sort of, as you were growing up and still today, you mentioned fish and chips. Was that sort of a treat? What was your favourite sort of food, and has that changed? Well,
yeah, fish and chips were a treat, mainly on Friday, although we're not Roman Catholics, but even so, mainly on Friday, it was fish and chip day. Another treat was a bottle of pop from the chip shop. I know it sounds strange, this, but I can remember there used to be a brand called Magnet Pop. They did all flavours, but that was the name of the firm that made it, like Nicholson's, they make Vimto. And I remember one day I minded my dad so much for one of these bottles of pop, and it was only threepence in old money, which to my dad was a lot of money because he was only getting 23 and sixpence on the dole. And he gave me threepence, and it was only after, as I got a bit older, I realised that probably that was his last threepence that he had. I can remember my mother sending me to the chip shop for a pennyworth of chips, a pennyworth or a pennyworth of chips. And I don't know why I did it. I don't like peas. I do now, but as a child I didn't like peas. But you could get a penny mix, which was chips and peas for a penny. And I asked for a penny mix. And when I went home, my mother said, "What have you got? What have you done that for?" She had a pan of peas on the cooker waiting. And I didn't realise that was my mother's last penny. And she was trying to make it go further so we could both have a fair number of chips each and peas from the pan. And I did that. So thinking about things that were sold there, of course ice cream, you had Walls, the man with a box on a bike, "Stop me and buy one" was his advert. Walls ice cream, and also El Dorado was another ice cream that used to come, and Lions was another, and these ice cream carts used to come round the streets ringing a bell. They didn't play a jingle, they used to ring a bell. We had other street traders that came as well. We had the Black Pea Man. He would come round, usually on a cold winter's night, and he'd ring his bell, and you could take your cup out for black peas, or even you could take your cup out if an ice cream van came. You could take your cup out and get a cup full of ice cream for a penny or whatever. Also, we had mobile shops, and ironmongers used to come round, and they'd have they'd have a big barrel of paraffin at the side, so you could buy a gallon of paraffin from them. The salt man used to come round where you could buy a big block of salt, and we used to put them in those special jars with special tops on so dampness wouldn't get in. And you got this big block of salt and used to put it, and there was quite a lot there, probably about £8 of salt, which would last 12 months in these jars. Next time you came, you bought another block of salt. There was a lot of street trader, the greengrocers used to come round, the fishmen used to come round. So there was quite a lot of things that happened then that don't happen today. And so there were brands that stick in my mind, like you just said, Vimto. Tizer was another drink that sticks in my mind. That was another old drink. I remember Vim, which you don't see today, scouring powder. And a lot of the Quap scouring powders, Clebo, that was a scouring powder. Also black lead. I used to buy black lead the cast iron grates. That was a big job on Friday night. Zebo it was called. Then you had Cardinal red polish, because after the war it became the common practice to paint your doorstep red and use Cardinal polish on it to keep it red. And so Lively Poly, that was a soap powder. First cut price soap powder that was sold in the shops. Threepence halfpenny a packet, I'm talking in proper money, Gradley money, and or 2 for sixpence halfpenny. So if you bought 2 packets you got it cheaper. So it was a real cut price. And that went, whether you bought it from an ordinary shop or when control prices were on, that was the actual control price. Threepence halfpenny or 2 for sixpence halfpenny. In Bolton, of course, we didn't use farthings. I can't tell you why. We certainly didn't use them at the Co-op, but unfortunately we were breaking the law, because in those days a standard small loaf was 2pence 3 farthings, and we charged threepence, you see, because we didn't use farthings. And we got reported to the Ministry of Food for overcharging on bread. Rightly so, I suppose. And they started issuing farthings. Well, I've shown you a check sheet. Writing a check sheet up is bad enough with halfpennies and pennies, writing it up, because you've got 20 to 30 checks on there, and you're writing it up in your head. And of course, when you've got farthings there, that threw you all together. Although I know it's easy enough to add a farthing, but you're so used to just seeing halfpennies and pennies, came on. Anyway, after about 9 months, we went back and we got rid of the farthings again. But I don't know whether they use farthings in Manchester. I honestly don't know, but we didn't. I know they did in London. I went down to London with my mother in 1937, and for a farthing, I could go in a sweet shop and buy 4 sweets from separate jars. I don't know how they had the patience to serve a child with 4 sweets from separate jars from a farthing, but there we go. So there were some labels that we remember. If you see any of the old street furniture, the street jewellery as they called it, that was the enamel advertisements for Vim and Mansion Polish. Those Camp Coffee was another thing that used to see an advert usually stuck in the corner of a window for Camp Coffee. And these were everyday things that people bought in those days, but they don't buy it today. I mean, we don't see Oxidol today. We don't see Rinso, one of Lever Brothers, Unilever's products. You see Rinso in America, but you don't see it in England. You see Persil in England. And it's funny, even a local brand like Acdo, which is a Bolton company, we find Acdo in Spain, in Tenerife, in other places. But you do find it in Bolton. You find it on the shops with only a small amount, but there it seems to be a good product. And they send it all over the world, to Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Canada. But in this country it seems to have died. But there you are. Those are some of the brand names that were regularly in use.
And sort of what sort of food do you enjoy now? Has it changed a lot? Are you still like traditional, or sort of with your travels?
Well, we're still traditional, my wife and myself. Very traditional. We feel like country gobbins when we go out with our grandchildren and we go to an Indian restaurant. And the girls will say, oh, we'll have some of that, and the noise. We say, what is that? Oh, it's chicken. Oh, is it? There you are. And so if we do go to an Italian, an Indian, or any other restaurant that doesn't sell English food, we're completely lost. We really are in the dark, because we don't really go out all that often. I mean, the thing is that when we were young, the only time you went in a restaurant is if you went to a wedding. Whereas today, I'm glad to say, like our grandchildren, it's second nature to go into a restaurant, be it English or foreign, it doesn't really matter. So we're more traditional. We probably eat more chicken now. I mean, chicken, when I was a lad, you really were top of the tree if you had chicken, you know. It was only Christmas that you sort of had a bird of anything kind. Whereas now, you can have chicken every day, and it is so cheap. And I think price comes into it as well, because a lot of the commodities that were expensive when I was a lad, anybody can afford them today, whereas I couldn't do them.
Okay. And just on to the final question. Now, I've not heard of this before. Did you ever visit any UCP shops?
Ah, yes. Yes, I did.
So for my benefit, could you explain exactly what they were?
Well, United Cattle Products were actually the tripe processors were individual companies. We had one in Bolton called Vos. They opened in about 1910, I think. They had 3 or 4 tripe shops in Bolton in the main. And actually, I think about 1917 now, maybe I'm wrong on the year, but a lot of the tripe dressers in Lancashire got together and formed a United Cattle Products company so that they could help each other in processing tripe and what have you. And I don't know that you know where tripe comes from, but it comes from a cow's stomach. And way back in the late 1800s, 1900s, in Bolton anyway, and probably other parts of the country, you had to have a license to dress tripe. You couldn't just open a tripe shop. You couldn't start processing tripe yourself. You had to have a license. And licenses were hard to come by. You either had to buy a company who had a license, or your family had a license itself. And you couldn't get one for love nor money in those days. And a little interesting story about the co-op, you were allowed to process and dress the stomachs of the cattle that you killed yourself, that you slaughtered. You didn't need a license for them. And the local tripe dressers in Bolton, around about 1900, they were watching the co-op, and they noticed that the co-op appeared to be selling more tripe than the cattle stomachs that they were killing. So they just thought that the co-op were buying tripe from somewhere else. They were taken to court, and they were found guilty, the co-op, of dressing tripe illegally. And they were fined 10 shillings, 50 pence, and that was it. But what was coming back to United Cattle Products, they used to have restaurants, and obviously the main thing on the menu was tripe or trotters or cow heel. And I never liked cow heel. If you ever had cow heel pie, it's very, very sticky. It really is. It's really sticky. I used to like trotters, and I used to like a little bit of tripe, but you have to put a lot of salt and vinegar on to get any flavour out of it. But UCP, they opened restaurants, not only here in Bolton, but in Wigan, probably Manchester, all in southeast Lancashire anyway, for a start off. And they did very well. You didn't need to have a tripe meal if you went in. You could have beans on toast or other things. They were very popular with the working population of Bolton, and they were all nice and clean. They were mainly tiled areas. The Maple, coming back to grocery, the Maple was always a tiled shop, floor to ceiling. And like the tripe shops, they had their own smell of tripe. I can't tell you the smell of tripe, I can't explain the smell of tripe, but every shop had its own smell. It had a unique smell. If you went in the co-op, you knew you were in the co-op because of the smell. If you were blindfolded, you'd know that smell. If you went into the Maple, you just smelt butter. They were noted for the butter, actually. If you went into Lipton's tea shop, By tea shop, I don't mean this kind of tea, I mean packets of tea. You could smell the tea. And so you went into ironmongers, you had this beautiful smell of firewood and paraffin and all the other things that make up. And so every shop in those days had a unique smell. Whereas you go into any shop today, and they're more or less, unless you go into a garden shop, they virtually all got the same smell. You walk into Asda, Morrison's or wherever, they all smell the same. Whereas way back in the 30s and 40s, they all had their own smell. Every corner shop had their own smell. Some corner shops smelled of potatoes because they had a lot of potatoes there. Others smelled of firewood and firelighters, and that was it. Yeah.
Okay, then, brilliant. Well, I think that brings us to the end of the interview. It's an interview with Norman Hindley on the 22nd of October 2009. I'd just like to say thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that's the end.
Thank you. Well, thanks very much. Thank you.